If you're a woman over 50 and the thought of being alone terrifies you, if you stay in relationships that hurt you because being alone feels worse, if you make yourself small and accommodating because you're afraid people will leave, if you lie awake at night imagining yourself old and alone with no one who cares, if the vision of yourself eating dinner alone every night for the rest of your life fills you with dread, if you've stayed in jobs you hate, friendships that drain you, relationships that diminish you, all because leaving would mean risking being alone, I need you to hear this. Your fear of loneliness is not protecting you. It's imprisoning you. It's making decisions for you. It's keeping you trapped in situations that are destroying you. And the deepest irony, the cruelest trick of this fear, is that while you're doing everything possible to avoid being alone, you're already living the thing you fear most. You're lonely. Right now. Today. Surrounded by people who don't really see you. In relationships where you're invisible. Living a life where you're physically present but emotionally absent. The fear of loneliness is one of the most powerful forces controlling women over 50. And I don't mean controlling in a subtle way. I mean it's running your life. It's the fear underneath almost every other fear you have. The fear of leaving a bad relationship? That's fear of loneliness. The fear of setting boundaries. That's fear people will leave and you'll be alone. The fear of speaking your truth? That's fear of rejection, which leads to aloneness. The fear of choosing yourself. That's fear that if you stop prioritizing everyone else, they'll abandon you and you'll end up alone. Every fear you have, when you dig deep enough, leads back to this one. The terror of being alone. And that fear, that bone-deep terror of aloneness, it runs so deep that you'll sacrifice almost anything to avoid it. Your peace, your dignity, your authenticity, your happiness, your self-respect, your dreams, your voice, your very self. All of it goes on the altar of not being alone. You'll tolerate disrespect from a partner because at least you're not alone. You'll stay in friendships that exhaust you because at least you have someone to call. You'll accommodate family members who treat you poorly because at least they're family and you're not alone. You'll say yes when you mean no, give when you have nothing left to give, show up when you need to rest, all to maintain connections that keep you from the thing you fear most, being alone. Because being alone feels like death. Not metaphorical death, actual death. When you imagine being alone, really alone, with no partner, no close friends, no one checking on you, no one caring if you exist, it feels like you would cease to exist. Like if no one is there to see you, you're not really there. Like your existence only counts if it's witnessed by someone else. And that feeling, that existential terror of not mattering if you're alone, is so overwhelming that you'll do almost anything to avoid it, even if what you're doing is making you miserable. Even if the relationships you're clinging to are empty. Even if you're lonelier with people than you would be alone. The fear is bigger than the logic. The terror overrides everything else. But here's what psychologist Walter Riso teaches about the fear of loneliness. He says it's based on a fundamental lie. A lie so deeply embedded in how women are raised that most women don't even recognize it as a lie. They think it's truth. The lie is this: being alone means you don't matter. That your value comes from being chosen by someone else. That your worth is determined by whether someone wants to be with you. That a woman alone is a tragedy, a failure, something to be pitied. That you need a relationship to be complete. That being alone means something is wrong with you. And as long as you believe that lie, as long as that belief lives in your unconscious mind driving your choices, you'll be controlled by the fear. You'll stay in bad relationships because a bad relationship feels better than no relationship. You'll tolerate disrespect because being disrespected feels better than being alone. You'll make yourself smaller and smaller and smaller, trying to be acceptable enough, easy enough, pleasant enough that people won't leave. And you'll live your entire life terrified of the one thing you're supposedly avoiding, but are actually already experiencing: loneliness. Because here's the truth most women don't understand until they're forced to face it. Being physically alone is not the same as being lonely. And being surrounded by people is not the same as being connected. These are not the same thing. You can be desperately lonely in a marriage. Many women are, lying next to someone every night and feeling completely alone because there's no real intimacy, no real seeing, no real connection. Just two people occupying the same space, performing the role of partners, but not actually connected. That loneliness, the loneliness of being with someone who doesn't really see you, who doesn't really know you, who you can't really talk to, is often worse than the loneliness of actual solitude. Because at least in solitude, you're not pretending. You're not performing connection that doesn't exist. You're not lying to yourself about having companionship when what you actually have is just proximity. You're just alone. And aloneness, when you stop being terrified of it, when you stop treating it like death, can actually be peaceful, sometimes even preferable to false connection. And here's what else Walter Riso teaches. The women who are most terrified of being alone are often the women who are already the most alone. Because the fear of loneliness creates the very thing it's trying to avoid. When you're terrified of being alone, you become clingy, needy. You give too much, you tolerate too much, you sacrifice too much. And that desperation, that fear-driven neediness, it pushes people away. Or it attracts people who want to use you. People who recognize your fear and exploit it. Who know you'll accept whatever they give because you're too afraid to be alone to demand better. So the fear of loneliness creates relationships where you're being used, not loved. Where you're convenient, not valued. Where you're there, but not really seen. And that's the loneliest of all. Today, I'm going to walk you through why you're so terrified of being alone. Not surface reasons like, I don't want to eat dinner by myself, or I'm afraid of growing old alone. Those are symptoms. I'm going to show you the deep psychological reasons. The roots of this fear that's been controlling you for decades, maybe your entire life. The beliefs you absorbed about what it means to be alone. The messages you internalized about your value being tied to being wanted by someone else. The fears that live underneath the fear of loneliness. Because the fear of being alone is never just about being alone. It's about 5 deeper fears that loneliness represents. And until you understand what those 5 fears are and where they came from, you can't transform them. Then I'm going to show you exactly what this fear is costing you. What you're sacrificing every single day to avoid the thing you're afraid of. Because most women don't realize the price they're paying. They just know they're exhausted. They just know something feels wrong. They just know they're not happy, but they don't connect it to the fear of loneliness. They don't see that the fear is costing them their peace, their authenticity, their self-respect, their life. And once you see the cost, once you really understand what you're trading for the illusion of not being alone, the calculation changes. The fear starts to look less like protection and more like prison. And finally, I'm going to give you a path out. A way to transform the terror of loneliness into the peace of solitude. A way to be okay, maybe even happy, by yourself. Not because you have to be. Not because no one wants you. But because you've discovered that being alone is not the tragedy you thought it was. That solitude can be rich, full, peaceful, even joyful. That you can have a beautiful life as a woman alone. And that once you're okay being alone, truly okay with it, you become free. Free to stay in relationships because you want to, not because you're afraid to leave. Free to set boundaries because you're not terrified of people leaving. Free to be yourself because you're not performing to keep people from abandoning you. Free to live. But you have to face the fear first. You have to look at it, name it, understand it, and then methodically dismantle it. And that's what we're going to do today, together. But before we go deeper, before I walk you through the 5 fears underneath the fear of loneliness, I need you to do something. If you're a woman over 50 who is controlled by the fear of being alone, if you make decisions based on avoiding loneliness rather than pursuing happiness, If you stay in situations that hurt you because leaving would mean risking being alone. If you're ready to face this fear instead of being controlled by it. If you're ready to discover that being alone might not be the death sentence you think it is. Subscribe to this channel right now. This is Enough and Whole. This is your space for facing the hard truths that set you free. We don't avoid uncomfortable topics here. We don't sugarcoat fear. We walk straight into it. We look at it. We name it. We transform it. Subscribe. Turn on notifications. Join thousands of women over 50 who are learning to be okay, truly okay with themselves. Let's face this fear together. Now let's begin. Let's understand why you're so terrified of being alone. And let's find the path from terror to peace. Why are you so terrified of being alone? The roots of the fear. Before we get into the 5 specific fears that live underneath your terror of loneliness, we need to understand where this fear came from, because you weren't born afraid of being alone. Babies don't have existential dread about solitude. Children play happily by themselves. This fear was taught to you. It was installed in you over decades through messages, experiences, cultural conditioning, and trauma. And until you understand where the fear came from, you can't dismantle it, because you'll keep treating it like truth instead of recognizing it for what it actually is. A learned response that can be unlearned. Walter Riso teaches that the fear of loneliness in women has 3 primary roots. 3 sources that work together to create the terror you feel today. And understanding these roots is critical, because each root requires a different approach to healing. You can't just tell yourself to stop being afraid. That doesn't work. The fear is too deep, too old, too embedded in your sense of self. You have to go to the roots. You have to understand where this came from. And then you have to methodically pull out each root until the fear no longer has anything holding it in place. The first root, cultural conditioning about women's value. The first root of your fear of loneliness is cultural. You were raised in a culture that taught you, explicitly and implicitly, that a woman's value comes from being chosen, that your worth is determined by whether a man wants you, whether you can attract a partner, whether you can keep a partner, whether you're desirable enough to not be alone. This message was everywhere, in movies where the single woman was portrayed as tragic or pathetic, in family gatherings where relatives asked when you were going to find someone, implying something was wrong if you hadn't. In the way married women were treated with more respect than single women. In the pity directed at divorced women or widows. The message was clear and constant. A woman alone is a woman who failed. And that message didn't just stay external. You internalized it. You absorbed it into your identity. You started to believe that your value really did depend on being wanted by someone. That if you ended up alone, it would mean you weren't good enough, weren't attractive enough, weren't worthy enough. That being alone would be proof of your inadequacy. And once you believed that, once that belief became part of how you see yourself, the fear of being alone became existential. Because it wasn't just about being physically alone, it was about your worth as a human being. This cultural root is particularly strong for women over 50 because you grew up in a generation where this message was even more explicit. You were raised in the 1960s and 70s when women's primary value was still largely tied to marriage and family, when being a wife and mother was considered the pinnacle of female achievement, when women who remained single or divorced were genuinely looked down upon. So you didn't just hear this message occasionally, you were marinated in it. It shaped your entire understanding of what it means to be a woman. And now, at 50, 60, 70, even though the culture has changed, even though intellectually you know women can be valuable and single, the emotional programming is still there, still driving your fear. The second root, attachment wounds from childhood. The second root of your fear of loneliness is psychological. It comes from your early attachment experiences, from how your parents or caregivers related to you when you were young. Walter Riso, drawing on attachment theory, explains that children who experience inconsistent love, conditional love, or abandonment develop what's called anxious attachment. They learn that love is unreliable, that people leave, that you have to work very hard to keep people from abandoning you. And that learning, that deep childhood wound, creates a lifelong terror of abandonment. If your parents' love felt conditional, if you had to be good or achieve or perform to receive affection, you learned that love has to be earned, and if it has to be earned, it can also be lost. So you became hypervigilant, always scanning for signs that someone might leave, always working to be good enough, acceptable enough, lovable enough to keep them from abandoning you. And that hypervigilance, that constant fear of abandonment, it's still running today. 50, 60 years later. You're still terrified that if you're not good enough, if you set a boundary, if you disappoint someone, they'll leave, and you'll be alone. Or maybe your parents weren't just conditional. Maybe one of them actually left, through divorce, through death, through emotional absence even while physically present. And that abandonment, that experience of someone you loved and needed disappearing, it created a wound so deep that you've spent your whole life trying to avoid ever feeling that pain again. So you stay in bad relationships, in draining friendships, in situations that hurt you, because staying, even in something bad, feels safer than risking the abandonment you experienced as a child. This attachment root explains why the fear of loneliness feels so primal, so overwhelming. Because it's not just an adult fear about practical concerns like, who will you have dinner with? It's a child's fear. The fear of a little girl who learned that people leave and that being left is the worst thing that can happen. And that little girl is still inside you, still terrified, still making decisions to avoid the abandonment she experienced or feared. And until you recognize that this is an old wound, not a current reality, you can't heal it. The third root, life experiences that reinforce the fear. The third root of your fear of loneliness is experiential. It comes from your actual life experiences that seem to confirm that being alone is terrible and should be avoided at all costs. Maybe you were divorced and experienced a period of devastating loneliness. Maybe you lost your partner and the grief and isolation felt unbearable. Maybe you had a period in your life where you were alone and it was genuinely difficult. And those experiences, those hard, painful experiences of aloneness, they reinforced the fear. They became evidence that your terror is justified, that being alone really is as bad as you think it is. Or maybe you watched someone else be alone. Your mother after your father died. An aunt who never married, a friend who got divorced. And you watched them struggle, watched them be lonely, watched them be pitied, watched them have a hard life. And you internalize that as evidence. You thought, that's what happens when you're alone. That's what I'm trying to avoid. That's why I have to do whatever it takes to not end up like that. And so their experience became your fear. Their loneliness became your terror. Even though their experience was theirs, not yours. Even though their circumstances were different. Even though what was hard for them might not be hard for you. Walter Riso teaches that these three roots, cultural conditioning, attachment wounds, and confirming life experiences, they work together to create a fear so powerful it controls your entire life. The culture taught you that being alone means you failed. Your childhood taught you that abandonment is devastating and must be avoided. Your life experiences gave you evidence that being alone is terrible. And together, these three roots created a belief system that runs unconsciously in the background of every decision you make. The belief that being alone is the worst possible outcome, and that you should sacrifice anything, everything, to avoid it. But here's what Riso wants you to understand. These roots, all three of them, they're based on distortions. The cultural message that a woman alone is a failure, that's a lie designed to control women. The childhood wound that says abandonment is death? That was true when you were 3 and dependent, but it's not true now when you're an adult who can take care of yourself. The life experiences that seem to prove being alone is terrible? Those were specific circumstances at specific times, not universal truths about what being alone always means. So the fear you feel, the terror that controls you, it's real. The feeling is real. But the belief underneath it, the belief that being alone means you don't matter, that you can't survive it, that it will destroy you, that belief is not real. It's a story constructed from cultural lies, childhood wounds, and misinterpreted experiences. And stories can be rewritten, beliefs can be changed, fears can be transformed. But first, you have to see them clearly. You have to understand where they came from. You have to recognize that the terror you feel is not telling you truth about reality. It's telling you about old wounds that need healing. And that's what we're going to do now. We're going to look at the 5 specific fears that live underneath your general fear of being alone. Because fear of loneliness is too vague. It's not specific enough to work with. But when you break it down into the 5 distinct fears it actually contains, when you name each one specifically, you can address each one individually. You can see which ones are based on reality and which ones are based on old stories. And you can start, methodically, to dismantle them. The 5 fears underneath your terror of being alone. Now we get to the heart of it. The 5 specific fears that live underneath your general terror of loneliness. These aren't abstract concepts. These are concrete, visceral fears that keep you awake at night, that drive your decisions, that keep you trapped in situations that hurt you. And the reason I'm breaking them down individually is because each one requires a different response. Each one has its own logic, its own emotional weight, its own hold on you. And when you can name each fear specifically, when you can see it clearly instead of just feeling a vague terror, you can start to address it. You can question whether it's based on reality. You can develop strategies to face it. You can transform it from a prison into something you can walk through. Fear. 1. Dying alone and no one knowing or caring. The first fear, and for many women the most primal, is the fear of dying alone. Not just being alone while you're alive, but dying alone. And specifically, dying alone and no one noticing, no one caring, no one finding you for days or weeks. Dying and having it not matter to anyone. This fear is visceral. You can picture it. You're old, you're sick, you fall, you have a heart attack, a stroke, and you're alone in your house, and no one knows, no one checks on you, no one finds you, and you die there, alone. And maybe no one finds you for days, maybe weeks, until a neighbor notices the smell, or the mail piling up. And that image, that nightmare scenario, it feels unbearable. This fear is particularly powerful for women over 50 because death is no longer an abstract future event. It's getting closer. You see friends getting sick, losing partners, dying. You feel your own body aging. You know that the time between now and death is shorter than the time behind you. And so the question of who will be there when you die becomes real, urgent. And if you're alone, if you don't have a partner, if your children live far away, if your friends are all dealing with their own aging bodies, the possibility of dying alone feels very real and terrifying. Walter Riso addresses this fear directly. He says, yes, some people die alone. That's true. But let me ask you something. Do you think dying surrounded by people guarantees a good death? Do you think having someone physically present means you won't feel alone? Because many people die feeling desperately alone, even with family gathered around. And many people die alone and at peace. The presence or absence of people is not what determines whether death is peaceful or terrifying. What determines that is your relationship with yourself. Whether you've made peace with your life. Whether you've lived authentically. Whether you've done the things that mattered to you. And here's the other truth. Staying in relationships that hurt you, tolerating people who don't value you, sacrificing your peace and authenticity to ensure someone will be there when you die, that doesn't guarantee anything. They might die first. They might not be there. They might be physically present, but emotionally absent. You're sacrificing your actual life, the years you're living right now, for the possibility of not being physically alone during the maybe hour or two of your death. And that's a terrible trade. Let me tell you about Linda. She's 68. She stayed in a miserable marriage for 40 years, partly because she was terrified of dying alone. She'd imagine herself old and sick with no one to care for her, no one to hold her hand, no one to be there at the end. And that fear kept her trapped with a man who treated her with contempt for decades. Then, at 65, her husband had a massive heart attack, died instantly, and Linda realized something. He died with her right there. She was physically present, but he died alone anyway, because they'd been emotionally separated for so long that her presence didn't matter. He died as alone as if she hadn't been there. And Linda realized she'd wasted 40 years being miserable to avoid dying alone. And her husband, who she'd stayed with for that reason, had died alone anyway. Not because no one was there, but because presence without connection is still aloneness. And she decided that if death might be alone regardless, she'd rather live her remaining years actually living instead of just existing to avoid a death that might be lonely anyway. Linda told me, "I was so afraid of dying alone that I forgot to live. And now I understand that dying alone isn't the tragedy. Living alone, truly alone, emotionally alone, even while surrounded by people, that's the tragedy. And I'd rather die alone after a life well lived than die surrounded by people after a life wasted. That's the first fear, dying alone. And it's real. But it's not a reason to live your whole life imprisoned. Fear 2, no one will take care of you when you're old and sick. The second fear underneath your terror of loneliness is practical. It's the fear that if you're alone, no one will take care of you when you're old and need help. And this fear is very real for women over 50 because you're watching it happen. You're watching parents need care. You're watching friends' parents need care. You're seeing what happens when people get old and can't take care of themselves. And you're asking yourself, who will do that for me? If I don't have a partner, if I don't have children close by or willing, if I'm alone, who will take me to doctor appointments? Who will help me when I can't drive? Who will make sure I take my medications? Who will advocate for me if I'm in a hospital or nursing home? Who will care? This fear feels completely logical. Unlike the fear of dying alone, which is emotional and existential, this fear seems practical and realistic. Because the truth is, aging often requires help. And if you're alone, getting that help becomes harder, more expensive, more complicated. So staying in a relationship, even a bad one, even one that makes you miserable, seems like practical insurance. At least you'll have someone there when you need help. At least you won't be completely alone trying to navigate aging. But Walter Riso challenges this logic. He says, are you sure the person you're staying with will actually take care of you? Because many women stay in relationships assuming their partner will care for them when they're old, and then their partner gets sick first, or dies first, or refuses to help even when they're capable, or provides resentful, minimal care that makes you feel like a burden. You're sacrificing your happiness now for care in the future that's not guaranteed. And even if it is provided, it might be provided with such resentment that it's worse than having no one. And here's the other reality. Being alone doesn't mean you won't have care. It means you have to plan differently. You have to build support systems. You have to have resources. You have to create community. You have to make arrangements. And yes, that requires effort and money. But it's possible. Millions of single older women navigate aging successfully. They hire help. They move into communities with support. They build networks of friends who help each other. They plan ahead. They create systems. And they do it without sacrificing decades of their lives being miserable with someone just for the possibility of future care. Let me tell you about Barbara. She's 70. She left her marriage at 62 because she was deeply unhappy. And one of her biggest fears was, who will take care of me when I'm old? Her husband had been her retirement plan, her care plan. and leaving meant giving that up. But Barbara did something smart. She used the money from the divorce settlement to buy into a continuing care retirement community, a place where she has her own apartment now while she's healthy, but where there are increasing levels of care available as she ages. She built friendships with other single women in the community. They check on each other, help each other, create informal support systems. And Barbara told me, "I spent years being miserable because I thought staying married was my care insurance. But my husband wasn't guarantee of care. He was just a person who might or might not have been willing and able to help when I needed it. Now I have actual systems in place, professional care available, a community of people. And I'm not spending my healthy years being miserable just to gamble on someone taking care of me in my unhealthy years." That's the second fear. No one will take care of you, and it's worth planning for. But it's not worth sacrificing your life for. Fear 3. You'll be forgotten. Your life won't matter to anyone. The third fear underneath your terror of loneliness is existential. It's the fear that if you're alone, your life won't matter, that you'll be forgotten, that you'll live and die, and it won't have made any difference to anyone, that there will be no one to remember you, no one who cares that you existed, no one whose life was enriched by knowing you. And this fear cuts deep because it's about meaning, about mattering, about whether your existence has significance beyond yourself. This fear manifests in specific ways. You imagine your funeral and no one comes, or only a handful of people who feel obligated. You imagine dying and having no one to leave anything to, no one who wants your possessions because they remind them of you. You imagine your photos ending up in a dumpster because no one cares enough to keep them. You imagine existing for 70, 80 years and then vanishing without a trace, without having mattered to anyone. And that feels like the ultimate tragedy, like your whole life was pointless. And this fear drives so much behavior. You stay in relationships where you're not valued because at least you matter to someone, even if they treat you poorly. At least your existence affects someone's life, even if the effect is just being available when they need something. You maintain friendships that drain you because at least these people know you exist. At least you're not completely forgotten. You tolerate being treated as an afterthought because an afterthought is better than not being thought of at all. But Walter Riso teaches something revolutionary about this fear. He says the belief that you only matter if someone else says you matter is the root of the problem. You've externalized your worth. You've made other people the arbiters of whether your life has meaning. But your life's meaning doesn't come from other people remembering you. It comes from how you lived, from whether you were true to yourself, from whether you did things that mattered to you, from whether you created beauty or helped someone or learned something or experienced joy. Those things have meaning whether or not anyone remembers them. And here's the hard truth. Even people who are surrounded by family, who have children and grandchildren, most of them will be forgotten within 2 generations. Your great-grandchildren won't know you, won't remember you, won't know your stories. You'll be a name on a family tree and nothing more. So the desire to be remembered forever by being in relationships, it's not realistic anyway. Almost everyone is forgotten. That's not a tragedy. That's just how time works. What matters is not whether you're remembered. What matters is whether you lived, whether you were present in your own life, whether you experienced beauty and joy and meaning, whether you were authentically yourself. And you can do all of that alone. Your life can matter to you even if it doesn't matter to anyone else. And actually, once you stop needing other people to validate your existence, once you stop needing to be remembered to feel like your life mattered, you become free. Free to live for yourself. Free to find meaning in your own experiences. Free to be present in your life instead of performing for an audience that will forget you anyway. Let me tell you about Carol. She's 66. She spent her whole life being terrified that she wouldn't matter. So she did everything for everyone. Made herself indispensable. Thought that if people needed her, she'd matter. And she was exhausted, depleted. and still terrified that if she stopped being useful, everyone would forget her. Then her best friend died suddenly, and at the funeral, everyone told stories, beautiful stories about this woman. But Carol realized something. Her friend had mattered because of who she was, not because of what she did for people. She'd mattered because she was authentic, joyful, present. And people remembered her because she'd actually lived, not because she'd made herself useful. And Carol realized, I've been trying to matter by being needed. But my friend mattered by being herself. And I want to matter like that. I want my life to have meaning because I lived it fully, not because I made myself indispensable to people who might forget me anyway. That's the third fear, being forgotten, not mattering. And it's real. But it's based on the false belief that your worth comes from other people's memory of you. It doesn't. It comes from how you live. Fear 4, you'll have no one to share your life with, no witness to your existence. The fourth fear is about companionship and witness. It's the fear that if you're alone, you'll have no one to share your life with, no one to tell about your day, no one to laugh with, no one to share experiences with, no one who witnesses your existence. And this fear is about the deep human need for connection, for someone who sees you, who knows you, who cares about what happens to you. The fear is that being alone means living a life where nothing you experience matters because there's no one to experience it with you. Where you're living, but no one sees you living. And that feels empty, meaningless. This fear manifests in very specific ways. You imagine coming home every day to an empty house. No one to tell about the funny thing that happened at the grocery store. No one to share the sunset with. No one to say, "Can you believe this?" when something outrageous happens in the news. No one to look at you across the table at dinner. No one to witness your daily existence. And that witnessing, that being seen by someone who cares, it feels essential. Like without it, you're not quite real. Like you're living in a void. And so you stay in relationships where you're not really seen. Where your partner doesn't really listen. Where you talk and they're on their phone. Where you share and they dismiss. Where you're technically not alone, but you're not really witnessed either. Because even that empty companionship feels better than no companionship. At least there's someone in the room even if they're not really present. At least you're not completely alone. But Walter Riso challenges this fear directly. He asks, what's worse? Being alone with no one to share with? Or being with someone who doesn't really see you, doesn't really care, doesn't really witness you? Because at least when you're alone, you're not pretending. You're not performing sharing for someone who's not actually receiving it. You're just alone. And there's something honest about that, something clean. You're not lying to yourself about having companionship when what you actually have is just proximity. And here's what else Riso teaches. The need for witness, the need for someone to see your life and validate that it matters. That need can be met in ways other than a romantic partner or even a close friend. You can witness yourself. You can develop a practice of being present to your own life, of noticing your own experiences, of validating your own existence. You can journal, photograph, create art, document your life for yourself, and you can find community. People to share specific experiences with, even if they're not the one person who witnesses everything. But most importantly, Riso says that the fear of having no one to share with is often covering a deeper fear, the fear of being with yourself. Because if you have no one to share with, you're left alone with yourself. And if you don't like yourself, if you don't find your own company interesting or enjoyable, if being alone with your thoughts feels unbearable, then of course the absence of other people feels terrifying. You're not really afraid of having no one to share with. You're afraid of being alone with someone you don't like, yourself. And that's the real work. Not finding someone to witness your life, but becoming someone whose life you want to witness. Becoming someone whose company you enjoy. Becoming someone you find interesting. Because once you actually like being with yourself, once your own company is genuinely enjoyable, The absence of constant companionship stops feeling like deprivation and starts feeling like peace. Let me tell you about Susan. She's 64. She was terrified of being alone because she thought life without someone to share it with would be meaningless. So she stayed in a marriage where her husband barely acknowledged her, where she'd talk and he'd grunt, where she'd try to share and he'd change the subject. She was desperately lonely, but at least she wasn't alone. Until one day she realized, I'm sharing my life with someone who doesn't care. I'm witnessing my own life, and he's not. So what's the difference between this and being actually alone? At least if I was alone, I wouldn't have the constant disappointment of trying to share with someone who doesn't want to receive it. So Susan left. And yes, coming home to an empty house was hard at first. But Susan started journaling, writing about her days, her experiences, her thoughts. And she started realizing that witnessing her own life, really paying attention to it herself, was actually more meaningful than the performative sharing she'd been doing with her husband. She was seeing herself more clearly than he ever had. And she joined a book club, a hiking group, built friendships with women who actually listened, who cared, who witnessed her in specific moments, even if they weren't there every day. Susan told me I thought I needed one person to witness my whole life, but what I actually needed was to witness my own life, and to have specific people witness specific parts. And that's actually richer than one person pretending to witness while not really seeing. That's the fourth fear, having no one to share life with. And it's real. But it's not solved by staying with someone who doesn't really see you anyway. Fear 5. Being alone proves you weren't good enough to be chosen. The fifth and final fear underneath your terror of loneliness is about worth. It's the fear that being alone proves something about you, proves that you weren't good enough, weren't lovable enough, weren't worthy enough to keep someone. That being alone is evidence of your fundamental inadequacy. And this fear is particularly painful because it's not just about being alone. It's about what being alone means, about who you are. This fear manifests as shame. Deep, corrosive shame about being alone. You don't just feel lonely. You feel embarrassed, humiliated. Like your aloneness is a report card showing you failed at the most important thing. Like everyone who sees you alone is judging you, pitying you, thinking, poor thing, no one wanted her. And that shame drives you to stay in relationships that hurt you because at least you're not proving to the world that you're not good enough. At least you can say you have someone even if that someone treats you terribly. Walter Riso says this fear is the most insidious because it's based on the lie at the center of all the others. The lie that your worth is determined by whether someone else chooses you. That you only have value if you're wanted. That being alone means something is wrong with you. And as long as you believe that lie, you'll never be free. You'll stay in situations that destroy you just to avoid the shame of being alone. You'll tolerate anything just to be able to say you're not alone. But here's the truth. Riso wants you to understand. Being alone doesn't mean you weren't good enough. Sometimes it means the opposite. It means you were too good to keep accepting less than you deserve. It means you had enough self-respect to leave something that wasn't working. It means you valued yourself enough to choose being alone over being mistreated. Being alone can be evidence of strength, not weakness, of standards, not inadequacy, of courage, not failure. And here's the other truth. Even if you were in a relationship, even if someone chose you, that doesn't prove you're worthy. Worth doesn't come from external validation. It comes from internal recognition. You don't become worthy because someone wants you. You are worthy, period. Whether someone wants you or not, whether you're alone or not, your value is inherent, not earned, not proven, not validated by someone else's choice. Inherent. Let me tell you about Nancy. She's 61. She stayed in a relationship for years where she was treated with contempt because she thought leaving would prove she wasn't good enough to keep a man. The shame of that, of being a divorced woman, of being alone, felt unbearable. But the relationship was destroying her. He cheated, lied, disrespected her constantly. And Nancy kept staying because leaving would mean admitting failure, would mean everyone would know she wasn't good enough. At 61, her therapist asked her a question that changed everything. Nancy, if your daughter was in this relationship, would you tell her to stay or leave? Nancy said immediately, leave. She deserves better. And her therapist said, so why don't you deserve better? And Nancy realized, I'm staying to avoid the shame of being alone. But the shame of staying, of accepting this treatment, of betraying myself, that's worse. I'm proving to myself every day that I'm not good enough by accepting someone who treats me like I'm not good enough. So Nancy left. And yes, some people judged, some people pitied. But Nancy realized something. The people who thought less of her for being alone were people whose opinions didn't matter. And the people whose opinions did matter, they respected her more for leaving. They saw her courage, her strength, her self-respect. Being alone didn't prove she wasn't good enough. Leaving proved she knew she was too good for what she'd been accepting. Nancy told me, I stayed for years because I thought being alone would prove I wasn't good enough. But staying in something that treated me as not good enough, that's what actually proved it. Leaving proved the opposite, proved I knew my worth. That's the fifth fear, that being alone proves you're not good enough. And it's the deepest lie of all. Your worth is not determined by whether someone stays. It's determined by whether you respect yourself enough to leave when you should. From terror to peace, how to transform your fear of being alone. Now we get to the most important part. Understanding your fear is critical. Knowing where it came from, knowing the 5 specific fears it contains, that's necessary. But understanding alone doesn't transform the fear. You can understand intellectually that your fear is based on old wounds and cultural lies and still feel terrified. Because fear doesn't live in your intellect. It lives in your body, in your emotions, in your nervous system. So transforming the fear requires more than understanding. It requires practice. Daily practice of choosing different thoughts, different actions, different responses until the new pattern becomes as automatic as the old one. Walter Riso teaches that transforming the fear of loneliness into the peace of solitude is a process with specific steps, not vague advice like just love yourself or be more confident, but concrete, practical steps you can take starting today. Steps that address each of the 5 fears individually. Steps that slowly, systematically dismantle the terror and replace it with something else. Not necessarily the absence of fear, but the presence of courage. The ability to feel the fear and choose yourself anyway. Step 1. Separate the fear from the reality. The first step in transforming your fear is learning to separate what you're afraid of from what's actually happening. Because most of the time, what you're afraid of is not happening right now. You're afraid of dying alone. But you're not dying right now. You're afraid of being forgotten. But people know you exist right now. You're afraid of having no one to share with. But you're sharing with yourself right now. The fear is about a possible future, not the present reality. And when you're living in fear of a possible future, you're not actually living. You're just avoiding a scenario that might never happen. Walter Riso teaches a practice he calls reality testing. Every time you feel the terror of loneliness rising, you stop and ask yourself 3 questions. First, what am I actually afraid of right now? Name the specific fear. Not, I'm afraid of being alone, but I'm afraid I'll die alone and no one will know. Be specific. Second, is that thing happening right now? Usually the answer is no. The thing you're afraid of is a possible future scenario, not a present reality. Third, what is actually true right now? Right now, you're alive. You're breathing. You have a home. You have food. You have yourself. Ground yourself in what's actually true instead of what might be true someday. This practice doesn't make the fear disappear, but it interrupts the spiral. It stops you from living in a catastrophic future and brings you back to the present. And in the present, you're usually okay. Not perfect, not without challenges, but okay. And practicing being present to what's actually true instead of what might be true is the foundation of transforming fear into peace. Let me give you a concrete example. You wake up at 3 a.m. with your heart racing, terrified. The terror is vague and overwhelming, so you stop and do reality testing. What am I actually afraid of? I'm afraid I'll be old and sick and alone and no one will help me. Is that happening right now? No. Right now I'm in my bed, healthy enough to wake up, safe in my home. What is actually true right now? I'm breathing. I'm warm. I'm safe. I'm okay in this moment. And you breathe into that truth instead of the imagined catastrophic future. You do this every time the fear comes. And slowly, over weeks and months, the fear's grip loosens. Because you're training your nervous system to stay present instead of spiraling into catastrophe. Step 2. Build evidence that you can be okay alone. The second step in transforming your fear is actively building evidence that contradicts it. Because right now, your fear is based on the assumption that being alone is unbearable, that you can't handle it, that it will destroy you. And as long as that assumption goes unchallenged, the fear remains powerful. But what if you tested it? What if you deliberately spent time alone and discovered that you're actually okay? That it's not the catastrophe you imagined? That evidence, that lived experience of being alone and surviving it, that's what actually transforms fear. Walter Riso recommends what he calls solitude experiments. You deliberately practice being alone in situations that usually trigger your fear. Start small. Spend an evening alone without calling anyone or watching TV to fill the silence. Just be alone with yourself. See what happens. Does it destroy you, or do you survive? Then increase. Spend a whole weekend alone. Take yourself to dinner alone. Go to a movie alone. Travel alone. Each time you're gathering evidence. Evidence that being alone is not death, that you can handle it, that you're actually okay. And here's what happens. The first few times are hard. The fear is loud. Your mind generates all the catastrophic scenarios. You feel uncomfortable, anxious. You want to reach out to someone, anyone, to make the aloneness stop. But you sit with it. You breathe through it. And you discover something. The fear peaks and then it subsides. It doesn't kill you. It just passes. And on the other side of it, there's often something unexpected. Peace, quiet, the ability to hear your own thoughts, the realization that your own company isn't terrible. Maybe it's actually kind of nice. Each time you do a solitude experiment and survive it, you're building evidence against the fear. You're proving to yourself that being alone is survivable. And the more evidence you build, the less power the fear has. Because it's hard to be terrified of something you've done dozens of times and survived every time. Step 3. Develop a relationship with yourself. The third step in transforming your fear is the most important. It's developing an actual relationship with yourself. Because the real reason most women are terrified of being alone is not because they'll have no one. It's because they'll be stuck with someone they don't like, themselves. If you don't enjoy your own company, if being alone with your thoughts is unbearable, if you need constant distraction from yourself, then of course the absence of other people feels terrifying. You're not really afraid of being alone. You're afraid of being with yourself. Walter Riso teaches that the antidote to fear of loneliness is not finding someone else. It's becoming someone you actually want to be with, someone whose company you enjoy, someone you find interesting, someone you like. And that requires actually getting to know yourself. Not the performed version, not the version you show other people, but the actual you. What do you think when no one is listening? What do you want when you're not accommodating everyone else? What brings you joy when you're not performing joy for someone else? Who are you when you're alone? Most women over 50 have no idea. They've spent decades being who other people needed them to be. Wife, mother, daughter, friend, employee, caretaker. They've performed roles for so long, they've forgotten who they are underneath the roles. So the work is rediscovering yourself. And that happens through solitude, through spending time alone, through asking yourself questions and actually listening to the answers, through trying things and seeing what you actually like, not what you think you should like. Riso recommends specific practices. Journaling, where you write your unedited thoughts and discover what you actually think. Solo activities, where you try things alone and see what brings you genuine joy. Meditation or silence, where you learn to be comfortable with your own mind. Therapy or coaching, where you explore who you actually are. And gradually, through these practices, you start to discover someone, yourself. And if you're lucky, if you do the work honestly, you discover that you're actually pretty interesting. Pretty good company. Someone you don't mind being with. And once that happens, once you genuinely enjoy your own company, the terror of being alone transforms. Because you're not alone. You're with someone you like. Yourself. Step 4. Create community without dependency. The fourth step in transforming your fear is building community in a way that doesn't recreate dependency. Because the goal is not to go from one extreme to the other, from being dependent on one person to being completely isolated. The goal is healthy interdependence, having connections with people without being controlled by the fear of losing them. Having relationships because you want them, not because you need them to prove you're not alone. Walter Riso teaches the difference between connection and dependency. Connection is choosing to be with people because the relationship enriches both of you. Dependency is needing to be with people because you can't tolerate being alone. Connection is mutual. Dependency is one-sided. Connection is free. Dependency is desperate. And the way you know the difference is this. In connection, you could be okay without the person, even though you prefer to be with them. In dependency, you believe you can't be okay without them. So the work is building connections while simultaneously proving to yourself that you'd be okay without them. You build friendships, join groups, create community, but you also practice being alone. You balance social time with solitude. You enjoy people's company without needing it. You appreciate connection without being controlled by the fear of losing it. And that balance, that ability to both connect and be alone, that's freedom. Practically, this means intentionally building multiple sources of connection instead of depending on one person for everything. You have friends you exercise with, friends you talk about books with, friends you share spiritual interests with, acquaintances who make you laugh, community members you volunteer with. You create a web of connections instead of putting all your eggs in one basket. And you also create a life that's fulfilling when you're alone. Hobbies, interests, projects, a home you enjoy being in, so you're not dependent on people for your well-being. You're enhanced by people, but complete without them. Step 5. Reframe solitude as gift instead of punishment. The fifth and final step in transforming your fear is changing the story you tell yourself about being alone. Because right now, the story is that being alone is tragic, a failure, a loss, something to be pitied. And as long as that's your story, being alone will feel terrible even when the practical reality is fine. You have to change the story. You have to reframe solitude from punishment to gift, from tragedy to freedom, from loss to gain. Walter Riso teaches that solitude, when chosen and embraced, is one of the greatest gifts of the second half of life. It's the opportunity to finally be yourself without performing, to discover who you actually are without the distortion of trying to be who someone else needs, to do what you want without accommodating everyone else, to live according to your truth without compromise, to have peace without negotiation, to be free. And here's what women who've successfully transformed their fear of loneliness all report. Once they stopped fighting against being alone and started embracing it, once they reframed it from tragedy to opportunity, their lives became richer. Not despite the solitude, because of it. They discovered interests they'd never had time for. They developed depths they'd never had space for. They became more themselves than they'd been in decades, and the solitude that once terrified them became precious, protected, something they chose instead of something they feared. This reframing requires practice. Every time you notice yourself thinking, "I'm alone and that's terrible," you stop and reframe. "I'm alone and that means I'm free to do what I want today. I'm alone and that means I can be completely myself. I'm alone and that's peaceful." You do this hundreds of times, until the new story becomes as automatic as the old one, until solitude stops meaning tragedy and starts meaning freedom. Let me tell you about Margaret. She's 69. She spent decades terrified of being alone. Then her husband died, and she was forced into the thing she'd feared most: widowhood, aloneness. And the first year was brutal. The grief was overwhelming, and the loneliness felt unbearable. But Margaret did the work. She did reality testing when the fear spiraled. She did solitude experiments to prove she could handle being alone. She developed a relationship with herself through journaling and therapy. She built community through joining groups and volunteering. And she practiced reframing, changing her story about what being alone meant. And at 69, 3 years after her husband's death, Margaret told me something surprising. She said, "I spent 50 years being terrified of this, of being a widow, of being alone. And now that I'm living it, it's not the tragedy I thought it would be. I miss my husband. I grieve him. But being alone is not destroying me. Actually, there are parts of it I really like. I do what I want. I eat what I want. I decorate how I want. I don't have to accommodate anyone. And there's a peace in that I never had before. I thought being alone would be the worst thing. But it's not. It's just different. And in some ways, it's actually better." That's what's possible when you transform the fear. Not that being alone becomes perfect or without challenges, but that it stops being the catastrophe you thought it would be. It becomes something you can handle, something that has gifts alongside the difficulties, something that might even be preferable to the alternatives. And once you're okay being alone, truly okay with it, you're free. Free to stay in relationships because you want to. Free to leave relationships that don't serve you. Free to be yourself without fear of abandonment. Free to live. The practical tools, your daily practice. So here's what transforming your fear of being alone actually looks like as a daily practice. Every morning, you do reality testing. You check in with what's actually true today, not what might be true someday. You ground yourself in the present instead of spiraling into catastrophic futures. Once a week minimum, you do a solitude experiment. You deliberately spend time alone practicing being okay with yourself. You journal. You try new things alone. You sit in silence. You get to know yourself. You build community intentionally. You reach out. You join things. You show up. But you also practice being okay without constant connection. You balance social time with alone time. You appreciate people without depending on them. You reframe every time you catch yourself thinking being alone is terrible. You consciously change the story from tragedy to freedom. And you track your progress. You notice when the fear is less intense. When being alone is less scary. When solitude starts feeling peaceful instead of terrifying. You celebrate those moments. You use them as evidence that you're changing, that the fear is transforming, that you're becoming free. This is not fast. This is not easy. Transforming a fear that's been running your life for 50 years takes time, takes practice, takes patience. But it's possible. Thousands of women have done it. Women who were as terrified as you are. Who thought being alone would destroy them. Who discovered it didn't. Who transformed terror into peace. Who learned to be okay, truly okay, by themselves, and who now live with a freedom they never had before. Your fear does not have to control you anymore. So here we are. We've walked through the entire landscape of your fear of being alone. We've looked at where this fear came from, the 3 roots that created it. Cultural conditioning that taught you a woman alone is a tragedy. Attachment wounds from childhood that made abandonment feel like death. Life experiences that seem to confirm that being alone is terrible. We've named the 5 specific fears that live underneath your general terror of loneliness. The fear of dying alone. The fear of having no one to care for you when you're old. The fear of being forgotten. The fear of having no one to share life with. The fear that being alone proves you're not good enough. And we've walked through the 5 specific steps to transform that fear. Reality testing, solitude experiments, developing a relationship with yourself, building community without dependency, reframing solitude from punishment to gift. This is not theoretical information. This is a map from where you are now, controlled by fear, to where you could be, living in peace. And the journey from here to there is not impossible. It's not reserved for special people who are naturally confident or emotionally healthy. It's available to you, to any woman willing to do the work, willing to face the fear instead of being controlled by it, willing to practice the steps even when they're uncomfortable, willing to choose herself even when it's scary. But I need you to understand something. This transformation will not happen by accident. It will not happen by wishing or hoping or waiting for the fear to go away on its own. Fear doesn't go away on its own. It grows. It gets stronger. It takes up more space in your life. The only way fear transforms is if you actively, deliberately, consistently work to transform it. And that work is hard, not because the steps are complicated. They're actually quite simple, but because they require you to do the thing that terrifies you. To be alone when being alone feels unbearable. To sit with discomfort when everything in you wants to run from it. To choose yourself when choosing yourself feels selfish or scary or wrong. Walter Riso teaches that the women who successfully transform their fear of loneliness all share one quality: courage, not the absence of fear, but the willingness to feel fear and act anyway. The willingness to be terrified of being alone and spend time alone anyway. The willingness to believe being alone proves you're not good enough and leave a relationship that treats you as not good enough anyway. The willingness to imagine dying alone and choose peace in life over the illusion of guaranteed companionship in death anyway. Courage is not about not being afraid. Courage is about being afraid and choosing yourself anyway. And here's what I need you to know. You have that courage. You might not feel like you do. You might feel like you're too afraid, too weak, too dependent to ever be okay alone. But you have the courage. The evidence is that you're here. You watched this entire video. You didn't turn it off when it got uncomfortable. You didn't run away when I named the fears you've been avoiding. You stayed. You listened. You let yourself see what you've been afraid to look at. That's courage. That's the beginning of transformation. And if you have the courage to face the fear in this video, you have the courage to face it in your life. But courage requires support. It requires tools. It requires community. And that's why I need you to do something right now. Go to the comments. I want you to answer one question. Which of the 5 fears is the loudest for you? Is it the fear of dying alone? The fear of no one taking care of you? The fear of being forgotten? The fear of no one to share with? The fear that being alone proves you're not good enough? Just name it. You don't have to share your whole story if you're not ready. Just name the fear. Because naming it is the first step to dismantling it. And when you name it in the comments, you'll see something. You'll see hundreds of other women naming the same fear. And you'll realize you're not alone in this fear. You're not uniquely broken or weak or afraid. You're human. And this fear is universal. And we're all working to transform it together, and I'll be there. I read every comment, and I want to hear which fear is controlling you. Because once you name it, once you see that other women share it, once you commit publicly to facing it, the transformation begins. The fear starts losing its power. So go right now. Comment. Tell me which fear is yours. Make it real by naming it. Now, before you go, I need 2 more things from you. First, if you haven't already, subscribe to this channel right now. Enough and Whole is not just a channel. It's a community of women over 50 who are done being controlled by fear. Who are choosing courage. Who are learning to be okay, truly okay by themselves. Who are discovering that the second half of life can be the most free half if you're willing to face the fears that have been controlling you. Subscribe. Turn on notifications. Because every week, we're diving deep into the psychology of living freely after 50, and you need to be here for it. Second, share this video. Think about one woman who needs to hear this. Your sister, your friend, your mother. Someone who's staying in a relationship out of fear of being alone. Someone who's making herself small because she's terrified people will leave. Someone who needs permission to face this fear. Send her this video right now. Because the more women who face this fear, who transform it, who become free, the better all of our lives become. We lift each other up, so share it. Help another woman find her courage. Now let me tell you what's possible if you do this work. If you face your fear of being alone, if you practice the 5 steps, if you transform terror into peace, I'm not going to promise you that being alone will be perfect. I'm not going to tell you that you'll never feel lonely. I'm not going to say that solitude has no challenges. Those would be lies. Being alone is sometimes hard, sometimes lonely. Sometimes you'll wish you had someone to share something with. Sometimes you'll feel the ache of not having a partner. Those feelings are real and they're okay. But here's what I can promise you. If you do this work, the terror will transform. The fear that's been controlling your life for decades will loosen its grip. Being alone will stop feeling like death and start feeling like freedom. You'll discover that you're actually okay by yourself, that you're good company, that your own presence is enough, that you can handle solitude without it destroying you. And once you discover that, once you're truly okay being alone, your entire life changes. You'll stop staying in relationships out of fear. You'll stay because you want to, or you'll leave because you should. You'll stop tolerating disrespect because you're afraid the person will leave. You'll require respect or you'll leave first. You'll stop making yourself small because you're afraid of being abandoned. You'll take up space because you know you're okay whether people stay or go. You'll stop performing to keep people from leaving. You'll just be yourself, and the people who appreciate that will stay, and the people who don't will go, and you'll be okay either way. And that freedom, that ability to be yourself without terror, that's what the second half of life is supposed to be. That's the gift of aging if you're willing to do the work. The first half of life is about accommodation. Performing, trying to be who everyone needs you to be. But the second half can be about authenticity, freedom, being who you actually are. And the key that unlocks that freedom is becoming okay with being alone. Because once you're okay being alone, you're no longer controlled by the fear of it. And without that fear controlling you, you're free. Walter Riso says that women who successfully make this transformation, who go from being terrified of loneliness to being at peace with solitude, they all report the same thing. They say, "I wish I'd done this decades ago. I wasted so much time being afraid, sacrificed so much to avoid something that turned out to not be the catastrophe I thought it would be. And now, on the other side of the fear, I'm more myself than I've ever been, more free, more at peace. And I can't believe I almost didn't do this work because I was too afraid." Don't be that woman who looks back with regret. Don't waste the years you have left being controlled by a fear you could transform. Don't sacrifice your peace, your authenticity, your freedom, because you're too afraid to face the thing that terrifies you. Because here's the truth. The fear of being alone is worse than actually being alone. The terror you feel when you imagine it is worse than the reality of living it. And the only way you'll discover that is by facing it. So start today. right now. Do the first reality testing. Ask yourself, what am I actually afraid of? Is it happening right now? What's actually true right now? Ground yourself in the present instead of the catastrophic future. Plan your first solitude experiment. One evening alone this week with no distractions. Just you and yourself. See what happens. Start journaling. Ask yourself, who am I when I'm alone? What do I actually want? What do I actually think? Start getting to know yourself. And every day, practice the reframe. Every time you catch yourself thinking being alone is terrible, stop. Change the story. Being alone means I'm free. Being alone means I can be myself. Being alone is peaceful. Do this hundreds of times until the new story becomes automatic. And track your progress. Notice when the fear is quieter, when being alone is less scary, when solitude starts feeling peaceful instead of terrifying. Celebrate those moments. Use them as evidence that you're changing. This is your journey. From terror to peace, from fear to freedom, from being controlled by the possibility of being alone to being empowered by the reality that you're okay by yourself. It's not an easy journey, but it's a worthwhile one, and it's available to you. Starting today. Starting right now. You are not too old to transform this fear. You are not too damaged. You are not too afraid. You are exactly where you need to be. And the fact that you're here, that you watched this entire video, that you're still reading these words, that means you're ready. Ready to face what you've been avoiding. Ready to choose courage over comfort. Ready to discover that you're okay, that you've always been okay, that being alone is not death, it's just different. And different can be beautiful. The women who've done this work, who've transformed this fear, they're waiting for you. They're in the comments. They're in this community. They've walked the path from terror to peace. And they're here to tell you it's possible, that you can do this, that the fear doesn't have to control you anymore, that freedom is available, that peace is possible, that you can be okay, truly okay, by yourself. And once you are, everything changes. So welcome to the beginning of your transformation, the beginning of your freedom, the beginning of a life where you're no longer controlled by the fear of being alone, but empowered by the knowledge that you're okay by yourself. This is where it starts, right here, right now, with you choosing to face the fear instead of being controlled by it. You are enough. You are whole, and you don't need someone else to prove it. You just need to discover it for yourself. Welcome to your journey. Welcome to your courage. Welcome to your freedom. Now go. Comment, subscribe, share, and start the work. Your second half is waiting, and it can be the most free, most authentic, most peaceful half you've ever lived, but only if you're willing to face the fear that's been holding you back. And I believe you are. I believe you have the courage. I believe you can do this. Welcome home to yourself.